my name is Ghisolfi. I am a PhD student at Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and today I'm going to talk about dynamics among pathways to decarbonize freight transport system. So first, I will give a short context about emissions and the decarbonization of a freight transport system, the results and gaps of a previous literature review, the feedback loops and the dynamics of a conceptual model, a qualitative approach at this stage, and some conclusions. One of the most important challenges nowadays is the climate change. But how much more CO2 can be emitted? This graph simulates a budget of 600 gigatons of carbon content at different emissions rates. According to this graph, emissions need to peak or start to decline before 2030 to give us a fighting chance of achieving the goal of zero emissions in the second half of this century. So basically, we need to flatten the curve as soon as possible to not collapse the system. Annual emissions need to peak soon and drop sharply because the longer the delay, the steeper the decline needed. But for this, we must be able to identify and understand what are the implicit dynamics within the system that have the potential to speed up the emissions decline. So, what are the contributions of freight transport to global emissions? Freight transport is responsible for around 90% of all logistics emissions, which means about 7 to 8% of global energy-related CO2 emissions. But the problem is that there will be a significant increase in freight transport demand in the next few years, besides its heavy dependence on fossil fuels. There are many strategies to mitigate emissions from freight transport sector, which can be clustered into 5 sets according to McKinnon, which are demand reduction, mode choice, vehicle loading, vehicle energy efficiency, and the use of alternative fuels. McKinnon also presented this combination of targets for all of these measures to achieve 83% of carbon emissions reduction. But my question is it achievable in 20 or 30 years? How much time we need to implement these measures and achieve these goals? What are the implicit dynamics among these strategies? By dynamics, I mean time response, given that there are many interactions between multiple sectors and the different stakeholders' goals. So first, we carried out a literature review addressing system dynamics models for freight transport decarbonization to identify the strategies that have been modeled and how dynamics hypotheses were considered in these models. So after the identification and selection process, I have found 13 system dynamics models that address at least one decarbonization strategies for the freight transport system. I bring here a brief of the results and gaps from the literature analysis. So first, from this graph, we can see that as expected, some decarbonization measures are more popular than others, with mode choice in the first place. From table 1, we can see that any model covered all the 5 decarbonization strategies together, with just 2 models covering the maximum 3 of these measures. And finally, there is a lack of information about their dynamics, that is, they are not very clear in their assumptions or assumed delays for each decision of stakeholders to achieve their results in their defined terms. Just to contextualize, this is part of my PhD research that is still in progress. First, I carried out this literature review to identify gaps and new research opportunities, which paper is already submitted and is currently under review. Now I am at this conceptual modeling stage that I will present in the sequence. This conceptual model integrates the 5 decarbonization strategies, and the causal loop diagrams provide an easy way to identify feedback loops and the dynamic links, that is, what determines whether the system will change quickly or slowly over time. The next step will include a data survey, interviews with stakeholders, model tests, and scenario simulations. The conceptual model is divided in 5 submodels according to the 5 decarbonization strategies. The emissions of freight transport come from burning fuels, leading to GHG emissions. So, fuel consumption is placed as the core of the emissions problem in the 5 submodels. GHG emissions are also influenced by carbon density, which depends on the fuel type used, and by policies effects. Policies variable is the sum of all policies coming from the 5 submodels, which can be economic, legal, social, or knowledge-based instruments. The increasing emissions requires stricter policies, which can decrease emissions levels after their implementation, illustrated by this negative feedback loop, bringing equilibrium to these variables. Moreover, there are a significant time response before and after this policy's implementation until it can decrease emissions levels. The 5 decarbonization measures are linked in the conceptual model to fill one of the gaps found in the previous literature review. But why is it so important? Because of this integrated view of the system shows how the strategies affect each other. In this case, for example, a number of trips came from vehicle loading submodel, and here it will affect total traveled distance and demand for freight transport activity. So, with these initial considerations in this first submodel, I highlighted this positive feedback loop between goods consumption and freight transport activity, meaning that these two variables are proportional to each other. I also highlighted the dynamic links with these delay marks, meaning that there are significant time responses between the related variables. They are considered in the implementation of economic instruments, such as all of these taxes over products' prices, and also in the implementation of new concepts such as shared and circular economy and how they can impact consumer behavior and goods consumption over time. All dynamic links are explained in detail in the paper, but here I will give some examples of these dynamic impacts. For instance, shared economy is applied to specific products or services, and despite its adoption is increasing, we do not know how much time it will take to reach levels that they can make a significant impact on the volume of goods demand reduction. So, in this first freight transport demand submodel, it was identified two main groups of dynamics measures that can impact the time delay of the whole system, which are economic instrument policies and changes in consumer behavior. As I said before, this part of the model is going to appear in the next submodels too. In the mode choice submodel, there is another positive feedback loop between GDP and public sector investments in infrastructure, presenting dynamic links, both in the design phase of these investments and in the execution phase of these projects that we also have to take into account. Again, the implementation of economic instruments can take some time before they influence generalized costs in the calculation of mode choice. For example, in the conflict over a fair balance of taxes between different modes can bring significant delays to shifting process from one mode to other less polluting. Therefore, in the second submodel, the main dynamic measures that will impact the time delay of the system are the implementation of both economic instrument policies and infrastructure investments. Regarding vehicle utilization submodel, there is another positive feedback loop involving vehicle loading, number of trips, and shipment amount. The greater the vehicle loading, the smaller the number of trips, which leads to a greater shipment amount, increasing vehicle loading again. Two dynamic links were identified. The first one in vehicle size and weight restrictions, and the second one in research and development of new technologies such as loading matching services, as the maturation and large-scale use of new technologies can take some time. Thus, in this third submodel, the dynamic links are related to legal and knowledge-based instruments that can delay or speed up the measures towards decarbonization. The positive feedback loop in this submodel is formed by new technology vehicles adoption and purchase price, where the relations are inversely proportional in both directions. Dynamic links were identified again in research and development of new technologies and implementation of technology subsidies that will influence purchase prices. Other important dynamics links here are related to fleet renewal process, since companies do not consider to replace their fleets or buy new vehicles very often. Then, the entrance of new vehicles in the market, whether conventional or with new technologies, takes considerable time, since this renewal process depends on fleet scrappage related to vehicles' age, mileage, and used value. So, summarizing, this fourth submodel brings three dynamic levers, which are economic and knowledge-based instruments and the fleet renewal process. In the alternative fuel submodel, there are three positive feedback loops. The first one, where alternative fuels adoption and charging service infrastructure are proportional to each other. The second and third loops are related to costs and adoption of alternative or fossil fuels. Dynamic links show that there is a time response between the implementation of economic instruments, such as taxes or subsidies, and fuels prices. Other dynamic links exist in research and development of new solutions for alternative fuels, and in the charging services that depends on infrastructure investments. So, dynamic levers were identified as economic or knowledge-based instruments and infrastructure investments of charging services. So, to conclude, the main dynamic process identified in this conceptual model are related to policies implementation, which are tools for influence people, organizations, and their behavior in the transport sector. Dynamic levers were identified in the implementation process of economic, legal, and knowledge-based instruments, such as taxes or subsidies implementation, research and development, information and maturation for large-scale use of new technologies. Also, changes in goods consumption, infrastructure investments to support either the choice of alternative transport modes or vehicle and fuel adoption, and delays in the fleet renewal process also take part in the implicit dynamics and system change over time. So, I believe that this qualitative analysis provided insights for further discussion about the way that dynamics can unfold and impact the major objective, whether in short, medium, or long terms, since the accumulation of these dynamics can delay or speed up the system's change towards decarbonization. You can, of course, contact me on LinkedIn or by email if you like to know more about my research. And it just remains for me to say thank you, CAPS and CNPq, for supporting my research through a fellowship. Thank you to my supervisor's team and all of you for your attention.